Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai, chapter 5, Halacha 8. This is part 3 of the Shir in the Art Scroll 50A1. And today we're in the yeshiva and we're joined in person by Rabbi David Gilbert, who normally is with us on the phone, but today we're together in person at the yeshiva. So we're really going to be covering today the issues about Kuthians, the perforated pots, and then deeper insights in the separation of tithes, where you're dealing with separating out truma for cases about tevel and hulin and demai, and we're going to get some deeper insights as to specifics on the law in terms of what's going on with the issues on why they're having Demai in the first place. So it'll sort of tie everything up for Chapter 5. The main theme in Chapter 5 is dissimilar tithing statuses. That's going to be where you're tithing one thing on behalf of another. So for instance, there's a rule that you can't tithe dissimilar things. For instance, I can't tithe vinegar for wine. Rebbe ruled that it is like two different species. I cannot tithe pomegranates for dates. So normally, if I had a pile of pomegranates over here and had a pile of pomegranates over there, and I want to, it's going to be tevel, and I want to rectify the piles so I can use it, I can tithe this pile either individually and that pile individually. Or what I'm allowed to do is I can take the tithes both in pile A and all of it in pile A on behalf of pile A and pile B. So in other words, instead of physically taking the tithes out of pile B, since it's the same thing, I can take all of it together as if it's just one big pile, even if it's going to be separated. The problem is you can't do that when you have two different piles that are really different things. And that's really what Chapter 5 is about. Chapter 5 is about what happens when you have dissimilar tithing statuses. So perhaps you had a baker, and the baker got flour from an Am Haaretz who did no tithes at all. That would make it definite tevel. And then you had somebody who did some of the tithes, and that would be a different style of bread at the bakery. Well, normally, if everything were going to be the same at the same bakery, well, you could take out, you buy 5 loaves, you could take out from one of the loaves for the other 4 loaves, no problem. But when you have dissimilar things, you can't do that. And in this case, if you had dissimilar flours for the baker and different confectionaries, well, you would have different tithing statuses, and you can't tithe this for the other different types of breads or pastries. They are dissimilar, and that theme is continuing. So the Gemara starts off and it says, Rabbi Zerah quoted Rabbi Ahu, quoted Rabbi Tanhum Bar Chia, who said in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, and we're going to get into the Kuthians now. It says there are 2 cases in which people can tithe the tevel of others without permission. Now, what is that? Pnei Moshe says that's going to be where one person takes tithes from his own tevel to fulfill the tithing obligation for another person. And, by the way, that, says Amara Fulda, is going to be done without the other person's permission. When can you do that? Very interesting. So the Gemara says that the first case is when tevel becomes mixed with a majority of hulin. And we covered that a couple of halachas ago. So when tevel gets mixed with a greater amount of hulin, it becomes nullified according to biblical law. But according to rabbinic law, you still have to do the tithes. Now, about the next case says that one who buys produce from the market of Kuthians. Now, in both of these circumstances, the tevel needs to be tithed d'Rabbanan, and that is the point of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says even though these people perhaps are not even Jewish. That was a suffix Tanayim. There was a debate about that, even in the time of, that's been a debate since, for a very long time. That was something that King David was dealing with. But we're dealing with a case where you have people who, even in a case where they're definitely not Jewish, according to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, you would be taking out the tithes for the produce that you purchased from them to Rabbanan. So for instance, if I came along and I purchased all of the farmer's detached produce from a non-Jew on land in Eretz Yisrael, I would still have to tithe it to Rabbanan. Now, Rabbi Meir's view is that those tithes you have to take out, and that would be, that you'd have to take out those tithes d'oraita because it would be treated like tevel. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is saying, yes, you do have to take out the tithes, but it's going to be d'Rabbanan. And over here, when you're buying from the Kuthi and at the market, you're still going to have to take out the tithes, but it's going to be d'Rabbanan. That follows Rabbi Shimon's point. So since the tithing obligation is just d'Rabbanan, the owner can't be trusted to fulfill it. And what this is basically going to be getting into is that another person should do it for him. So the Vilna Goan says about this that these rulings are going to assume that the owner cannot be trusted, and this is speaking about an Amma Aretz. Now, the Gemara in Nedarim in the Bavli in 36b is discussing whether one person can tithe another person's tevel without the other person's permission. And the Gemara over there is going to speak only of ordinary cases where it can be assumed that the owner would have taken care of the matter himself. And this is going to be in contrast with these two cases in the Gemara where the tithing requirement is going to be d'Rabbanan. And over here we have the owner, that being in the case of the Amma Aretz, he might not fulfill the obligation. And the Mara Fulda is saying that in these cases, it's certainly going to be permitted for another person to tithe his produce without his permission. Now, Rabbi Zera is going to hone in on this, and the idea here is going to become very clear what's going on, because the owner might not give an objection to someone else separating tithes in the cases where the Kohanim are going to be paying for the produce. So why not do the tithes? Because anyway, there's no loss for the person. So Rabbi Zera is going to comment on the second ruling that we were talking about with the Kuthians. And Rabbi Zera says that this teaching that one does not take money from the tribe of the Kohanim and Levim when giving them tithes from the produce that grew on the land of a non-Jew. And the Gemara says that if you argue that one does take money from the tribe, why does Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi say without permission? And the idea is, since the owner is going to be compensated, says Rabbi Zera, as though someone separated tithes from his produce with permission, that is going to be why it is going to be allowed. So in other words, if you have a case where you're going to be getting money from the tithes and there's no loss, not like you're taking out tithes and giving it away for free, well, even if you didn't get verbal permission, the guy would agree to do it. There's not going to be a malokit here. So according to Rabbi Zera, who's reporting Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's opinion, Rabbi Zera is saying about Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi holds that if someone's buying produce that grew on the land of a non-Jew and he gives the tithes to a Kohen, the Kohen doesn't need to pay. That, by the way, is consistent with Rabbi Zera's own version of this story in the Gemara in part 2 of this shir on chapter 5, Halacha 8 that we did yesterday, where Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is approving of Rabbi Yehuda ben Levi's decision not to pay for the tithes that he gets. Now, according to this entire discussion, it's dealing with the produce bought after it's been harvested. And it's also evident from Rabbi Zera that it's going to refer to produce that's bought from the market of the Kuthians. And so Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, in the case that Rabbi Simon is reporting from yesterday, is going to be requiring the Kohanim to pay money. And in some cases we see that because the tribe of the Kohanim can't prove that it is going to be Truma Gedola Doraita, that, okay, the Rabbanan, it still belongs to the tribe of the Kohanim, but the tribe of the Kohanim have to pay you for it. And so Rabbi Zera is saying that if you have a case where the Kohanim, the Rabbanan, have to pay you for it, and they can't prove it in a court of law that it's really Doraita Truma Gedola, well, you can tithe even without permission on behalf of another person, because anyway they're going to be getting paid for the produce. So the Tana Kama of this Mishnah is ruling that one may take tithes from the produce of one Kuthian for the produce of another Kuthian. Now, the majority of Kuthians, they did not tithe the produce that they're going to sell to other people. However, they're going to be tithing the produce that they are using for themselves. That is the quirk about the Kuthians. Now, this is making sure that you have a uniform tithing status for their produce. The Tana Kama of the Mishnah are ruling that you can tithe the produce that you got from two different Kuthians. You could tithe this for that because they are going to have the same status. That's the position of the Tana Kama. Now, there's a dissent to that. Rabbi Elazar forbids taking tithes from the produce of one Kuthian for the produce of another Kuthian. This, by the way, is going to be the minority view, and we have a rule called rov in that's majority, and that's really dictating that if you have a case where the majority is coming to do something, we have to give weight to that, and the Tana Kama are not going to be worried about minority chances where you might have a Kuthian that's coming and listening to the rabbis, and in this case coming and doing the tithes. If you had Kuthians that you knew for sure were doing that, then you really would have a dissimilar tithing status between this and that. And that's what Rabbi Elazar is worried about. Rabbi Elazar is forbidding this, taking the tithes from one Kuthian on behalf of the other Kuthians, because he's concerned that maybe a minority of the Kuthians are going to actually be tithing it before they sell it to someone else. And again, rov, we care about the majority. Now, Rabbi Elazar's view is going to be problematic. Why? Because Kuthians are generally not going to tithe what they sell. My own observation about this is that, you could have a case where, maybe they're not going to listen to the rabbis, and in fact, that was also the majority, was that they did not regard what the rabbis were saying or issues of oral law and things like that. But perhaps at the marketplace, what could be a case where Rabbi Elazar's view would actually make any sense, although it would not be the halacha, and it would, by the way, fit also with the minority issue. It would be a case where perhaps a Kuthian who is not going to listen to the rabbis and he is going to sell untithed produce to other people, but he is going to tithe his own produce that he has. So perhaps he tithes the produce he has, and later on he changes his mind and he goes to sell it at the marketplace, goes to sell it to other people. That produce is tithed. So in the minority case chance, you might actually have a situation where you ended up with tithed Kuthian produce, and you would not be able to tithe this for that because they are two dissimilar things. Something that already had tithes taken out of it is not like something that definitely did not have tithes taken out of it. So this, again, would be a case where, Rabbi Elazar would forbid tithing the produce of two Kuthians together, and the Gemara is going to explain it, although that's not going to be the halacha. Rabbi Yochanan is going to give the explanation, and he says, The reason of Rabbi Elazar is as follows. Just as the rabbis made the produce of Eretz Yisrael forbidden as Demai, following the majority, and nevertheless, one cannot separate Truma or Meiser from the produce of one Am Haaretz for the produce of another Am Haaretz, because we are worried about the possibility that one of them separated tithes, whereas the others did not. In other words, when the rabbis are setting up the laws of Demai, they must have taken into account the fact that the majority of the Am Haaretzim are in fact going to tithe the produce. But, yes, you do have this majority, but the rabbis are going to look at the produce of some of the Am Haaretzes who are not taking out the tithes or just taking out Truma Gedola. And this enactment of Demai is going to be an entirely rabbinic innovation, just like the rabbinic law that you have to tithe vegetables, which you're going to see in Masechet Trumos. But there should be nothing wrong with tithing together the produce of two Am Haaretzes. Why? Because each one should be subject to the same rabbinic obligation. Now, the previous Mishnahs are going to state that this can't be done. Why? Because one Am Haaretz might have separated tithes, and the minority chance is going to be the other Am Haaretzim did not. Evidently, says Amara Fulda, the rabbis did not attach absolute significance to the majority of Am Haaretzes who do tithe the produce. Rather, they also consider the possibility of the produce of the Am Haaretz that's either partially tithed or completely untithed. That's going to be similar to what's going on with the Kuthians. Now, again, you might have a minority case where some Kuthians might still believe that they are Jewish, and even after Rebbe declared that they were not Jewish, you had the Kuthians still saying about themselves that they were Jewish. So you might have a case where some Kuthians would be thinking that they were Jewish and listening to the rabbis, and in a minority case, if they're going to be selling produce, they would be tithing it like the way that they're supposed to tithe it before they sell to other people. Or, as I was saying, even if they are going to follow the majority of the Kuthians, they might have had a case where they would be intending to use the produce themselves, where they would do tithes, and then circumstances happened where they decided to sell it, and then now they're selling tithe produce. Either way, that would be a case where, that would be a minority where it would be tithe. And the Gemara continues and says, similarly, even though they made the produce of a Kuthian definite tevel following their majority who do not separate tithes, one cannot separate Truma or Meiser from the produce of one Kuthian for the produce of another Kuthian. Why? Because we are worried about the possibility that one of them separated out tithes while the other did not. Now, that's not the halacha. The halacha is going to follow the case of the Tanakh and the Mishnah. And I just want to point out the commentary by Rabbi Kanievsky about this, that in this case of Demai, the rabbis did not attach absolute significance to the majority. And in this case, the majority Kuthians who failed to tithe the produce, they also are going to be looking at the minority who do take tithes. And Rabbi Elazar is therefore ruling that purchases from two Kuthians cannot be tied together, since it's possible that one was tithed and the other was not. Now, I just want to point out that in the Sefer Nir, it's pointing out that in light of Rabbi Elazar's concern for the produce of two Kuthians, who we would otherwise assume to be equal in the tithing status and tithing risk, he's certainly going to be forbidding tithing a Kuthian's produce together with a Jew's produce, and, by the way, with a regular non-Jew's produce. Since this point can be inferred from Rabbi Elazar's explicit ruling, there's no need for the Mishnah to mention it. So, although the Tanaim are initially going to be disagreeing about the status of Kuthians, the Kuthians were rejected from Judaism, and they were declared to be not sincere converts. And this change occurred when some Kuthians were discovered worshiping the image of a dove at Mount Gerizim. And this is going to be that, a confirmation that the conversion was not a real conversion. And then they're going to be treating, at that point, the Kuthians as non-Jews in all respects. But what makes this curious is that at this time, after Rebbe, the Kuthians still thought they were Jewish. So some of them might still be doing the tithes when they would be selling it to other people, the minority, because they still consider themselves to be Jewish, even though they were declared not to be. That's what makes this interesting case, and what makes it where it doesn't just say, okay, a non-Jew, because this is going to be a case where they could be separating out tithes, and yeah, I know that with a non-Jew separating out tithes, the tithes don't mean anything, but nonetheless, the status of this produce and a regular non-Jew's produce is not exactly going to be the same. And why could that be? Well, the Kuthians might decide to give it to Kohanim, and they might even sell it to Kohanim. So it's a very curious case, even after Rebbe comes and declares that they're not going to be Jews, and so it's not as clear cut as just saying, well, they're not Jews, and this is going to be just like any other non-Jew that we were talking about in part 2 this year that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is talking about. So, but anyway, this is going to be a case where, anyway, that is Rabbi Elazar's minority opinion, and the Tanna Kama ruled that the tithing status of all the Kuthians is going to be the same. And so that if you have produce that you bought from one Kuthian, you can tithe for the other Kuthian. That's going to be the halacha. And by the way, that would also reflect like if you were buying from a non-Jew, and would reflect and sort of save some of these problems that would come up with Rabbi Elazar's seemingly problematic view of this. So again, it's not going to be like Rabbi Elazar, but nonetheless, we want to understand the minority opinions. So the Mishnah is going to move on to the next part, and it was talk about produce in a perforated pot is going to be like produce grown in the ground, and that, by the way, is going to be subject to tithing even under biblical law. Why? Because it is getting nutrition from the ground, from the earth. And the Gemara now is going to talk about produce grown in the non-perforated pot. So Rabbi Bun Bar Hia says in the name of Rabbi Zera, ironically enough, Zera means seed, but anyway, regarding a non-perforated pot, they treated the tithing obligation of produce that grew in it as a doubt. In other words, they did not know whether the produce is the same as produce that grew in the ground. And I want to give a refinement on that. There's another sugya elsewhere in Zerayim that is talking about produce grown in a clay pot that's non-perforated, and they're ultimately going to rule over there in that sugya that because the roots can break through the bottom of the clay pot and ultimately get nutrition from the ground, it's going to have a status like it was grown in a perforated pot. And that's kind of what is going to be complicated here, because yes, very good that the roots didn't actually connect to the ground yet, but there's an inevitability. There's a potential that it ultimately will. And I think that's part of the point where there's a suffix and there's a doubt as to, it not being known whether this produce is going to be the same as produce that grew in the ground, because we're not talking about a day when you had plastic pots. If you wanted to have a pot it was grown in ceramic back then, and ultimately the roots really will get big enough on a lot of plants that will just break through the bottom of it and ultimately touch the ground and be getting nutrition from the ground. And that, for sure, is going to be like produce grown in the ground. Now, the Gemara is going to ask and say, but we learned in a Mishnah, produce grown in a perforated pot renders a vineyard forbidden as kilei hakerem. So this, by the way, says the Pnei Moshe, is that produce grown in a perforated pot is considered to be grown in the ground, and that is why it can affect all the kalayim prohibitions. So the Gemara continues. I mean, that's certainly going to be proof, right? Proof that the perforated pot is going to be like growing in the ground. I mean, if it can trigger the kalayim obligations and problems of it growing next to a vineyard, well, certainly that is proof enough. The Gemara continues, says, however, produce grown in a non-perforated pot does not render a vineyard forbidden. And that is going to be the question. In other words, by stating in the second ruling that the produce in a non-perforated pot fails to affect the vineyard prohibitions on kalayim, the Mishnah is implying that the produce is definitely not considered to be growing in the ground. And this seems to contradict Rabbi Ban Bar Chia's assertion that it is possible that such produce is going to be treated as it being grown in the ground. Now, Pnei Moshe says that even if the produce of a non-perforated pot was just possibly equivalent to produce of the ground, it would still render the vineyard prohibited because of the seriousness of the kalayim prohibitions. And that's a rule that we have in the Torah and in oral law, is that if you have a suffix on something d'oraita, and the seriousness of the vineyard prohibitions with kalayim is that you have to burn down the vineyard, you have to burn down the plants, and you can't get any benefit from that. And they're going to be ruling strictly on that. The Gemara answers, and it says, although the Mishnah does not say so, the vineyard is forbidden out of doubt. And so the Pnei Moshe is going to be saying about this that the Mishnah does not mean that there's no prohibition at all in the second case. Rather, its point is that the prohibition is not definite. And again, why couldn't that be? That can be in a day when you're growing in clay pots. And that, by the way, is going to fit with another sugya elsewhere in the Yerushalmi, that ultimately the roots can absorb the nutrition in the ground from a clay pot and break through the bottom. And it's going to stress that in contrast to the produce of a perforated pot, which has a definite prohibition, the produce of a non-perforated pot does not affect a definite prohibition, just a doubtful one. And the Rosh Cirilio is going to conclude that the Halacha does not accord with this Gemara, because if one uproots a plant from a non-perforated pot on the Sabbath, he's not liable to offer an Asham Toloi, and the produce of such a pot is going to be forbidden to Rabbanan. That's the Rosh Cirilio's opinion. However, that would not be the case if we're dealing with a plant that broke through the bottom and started to get nutrition from the ground. Then for sure that would affect the vineyard, and that would make it a case of it being definite. So we're going to get into something that's a little bit more complicated now, and I just want to preface it. So far, we've been talking about the laws of Demai, and we're worried about the possibility that the separated portion that you're doing is going to be tevel. And you have to tithe it. It's forbidden to a kohen before it's tithed, and you have to tithe it. And that's going to be really what the issue is. In other words, that's really the point. We're always worried about the possibility that a separated portion is going to be tevel. That's going to be the phobia. Why? Because, if you're eating definite tevel, you have a case of death from heaven. And it's so serious that the Torah is always going to be trying, and the oral law is always going to be trying to protect the people from this kind of fate. So the Mishnah stated, if someone separated Truma from Demai for definite tevel. Now, the Mishnah that we had a few halachot ago in chapter 5 goes like this, that there's a definite tevel seller, and if you have a case where you have a pile, and in the pile you have chulin, that means that all the ties have been taken out properly, and some tevel falls in, how do you fix it? You go to the tevel seller, and you buy some definite tevel from the approved tevel seller, and this can only be done by a haver, can't be done by an am haaretz, and you tithe for this over there. Why? Because both are going to have the same tithing status, even though the tevel is mixed into the chulin pile, that you're going to take this new tevel and you're going to tithe it in this other location, which happens to be in the chulin pile. And you're not separating out anything from the chulin pile. You're affecting the ties that's mixed up in the chulin pile from this clean pile that you got from the tevel seller. That's going to be one way to clean things up. Normally, you have tevel, you have to take out all the ties. Now, we've always been seeing so far a case where you don't separate out different ties. You don't take out ties for Demai for Demai. In other words, I have a pile of Demai over here and I have a pile of Demai over there, and you're forbidden to take out ties of Demai over here for ties of Demai over there. Why? Because that Demai might be not tithed at all. It might be partially tithed, where they just took out the Truma Gedola, or it might be fully tithed. It also might be a case where it's tithed of everything except for the Meiser Sheni. That's also another possibility. So you have different statuses. And the case that's going to be coming up is going to be three cases. There's three cases. You have a case where you have definite tevel, and you have a case where you're going to be trying to do definite tevel for Demai. You're going to have a case where you're going to be trying to separate out Demai for Demai. And then you're going to be trying to do another case where you have a mixture of chulin in there. And that's going to be your three cases. You have Demai and chulin mixed in. You have Demai for Demai, and you have definite tevel for Demai. Okay, those are your three cases. And Gemara is going to tie this up. And the Mishnah says, and this, by the way, gets into the perforated pot. So if one separated Truma from Demai for definite tevel, that's going to be the issue. So the Mishnah was ruling that in the other case, where one separated out Truma for definite tevel for Demai, the Goan is not allowed to eat the Truma before it's been tied. Let me say that again. So in the case where you separated Truma from definite tevel, and you're trying to do that onto a Demai pile, the Goan is not allowed to eat the Truma. You have to go tithe it. It has to be tithed. Okay? However, in the case where you're separating out Truma from a pile of Demai for another pile of Demai, the Mishnah did not say that the Truma must be tithed, and that would imply that the Goan may eat it as is without tithing it. Now, keep in mind that the Demai obtained from one Amma Aretz for Demai obtained from another Amma Aretz is going to be dissimilar. Now, the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to ask, and it's going to say, just like it is said, if one separated Truma from definite tevel for Demai, it is Truma, but it may not be eaten until Truma and Meiser have been separated from it. Now, that's going to be one of these cases. This is a case where you have definite tevel over here, and you're separating out the Demai from the Demai over there. And that's going to be where you can't eat it until the Truma and the Maestros have been taken out. Now we're going to get into the next case. That's going to be where you have Demai and Demai. The Gemara says that the same should also be said in the case of Truma removed from this pile of Demai for that pile of Demai. Now, going back to this first case of it being truma definite tevel, and you're taking out the truma of definite tevel, but you're trying to do it on the demai pile. So in the first case, where you're separating out definite tevel to try to fix a pile of demai, we're worried that the demai could be chulin, and that's going to be a case where the separated portion was originally tevel, and it still is tevel. You didn't rectify anything. If you have a case of this demai actually being chulin, and the guy actually separated out all the ties, and you're going to try to fix this pile of demai over here by separating out from definite tevel, and again, the issue is that we saw before is that you can't separate out the dissimilar ties. You can't separate out something that has a derabanan requirement on ties for something that's going to be a deraita requirement on ties, and vice versa. And that's the case over here. The problem that comes up is if you're trying to say, okay, I'm going to separate out definite tevel over here, well, that's for sure, you have to separate out ties for that on a deraita level for the tevel. But on the demai, that's going to be derabanan. It's dissimilar. You can't again, it's like vinegar for wine. Yes, they both might be grain, but they have different statuses, okay? And it's going to be treated as different. And the problem with the demai is maybe it's actually chulin. So if you over-separate out on chulin, you didn't do anything. You're still left with tevel. That's the problem. So the reason why it may not be eaten before it gets tithed is because it might be tevel. Now, in the second case, where you're going to be separating out truma from this pile of demai for that pile of demai, there too, it's also possible that the first demai is tevel and the second demai is chulin. So that the separated portion that you're going to try to separate for this, for that, it might be tithed, and it may not be eaten as is. So why then does the Mishnah not say in the second case too that the Goan is also forbidden to eat the truma before he ties it? That's really what the Mishnah is getting at. The Gemara is going to answer that, and we're going to finish up. Rabbi Ban Bar Chia says in the name of Rabbi Shmuel Bar Rav Yitzchak, this tells us that doubtful truma meiser of demai is like a doubtful mixture. In other words, if you're trying to separate out ties for demai, he's saying that it's like a doubtful mixture where you have a mixture now of truma and chulin. And in other words, says Rabbi Kanievsky about this is like a mixture of truma and chulin or actual tevel. It could be a mixture of tevel and chulin. And that's going to be regarded as doubtful truma. And the Gemara continues, and it says, and thus this doubtful trumas meiser of demai is exempt from the demai obligation, just like a mixture of truma and tevel. So if you separated out a portion, and that's going to be treated as truma, this is only due to the stringency of demai. Now, if you didn't have the law of demai, there would be no need to separate out truma from demai, because basically it would be nullified in it. And if you had a separated portion that would be doubtful truma, it could also just as much be chulin. And the rabbis did not impose the obligation of demai with respect to doubtful truma, just as much as they did not impose the laws of demai on truma that gets mixed in with chulin. Why? Because just like in a case of doubtful truma, it's not going to be tevel. In other words, they're worried about definite tevel. That's really what they're worried about. So what they're trying to say, says Rabbi Kanievsky, is that the law of demai does not apply in this case. We don't need to be concerned about the possibility that the separated portion is tevel. And the separated portion could be therefore truma or chulin. And by the way, that's going to be permitted to the Goan as is. A Goan has no problem to eat chulin. Goan has no problem to eat truma. The issues about what we're worried about, we're really worried about with the laws of Demai about the possibility that a separated portion ends up still being tevel. Okay, in other words, you went out, you did your ties, and you tie something that's still actually just tevel in the end. So if you have a case where, like in the first case, where you're trying to take something that is tevel, the right to tevel, and you're trying to take it on Demai, okay? That Demai might already be fully tied. And in that case, when you separate out the ties to try to rectify both piles together for your pile of tevel in pile A, not only for pile A, but also for pile B, and pile B is Demai, well, that would be a case where you didn't tie anything because you didn't fix the pile in the Demai because that's chulin. It had the ties taken out. And so when you give it to the Goan to eat, all you're doing is you're not giving him truma, you're giving him tevel. He's not allowed to eat the tevel either. So that's going to be the real issue, okay? You can't separate out tevel for Demai because if they didn't take out any of the ties, okay? And you know that for sure. Well, then you fixed it, no problem. But if they take out all the ties, there's nothing to tie on behalf of this new pile, and so you're still left with tevel. So, because you didn't remove the ties from the first part, because the second part's already been tied, and that's going to be the issue. And really, what this is telling us is that if you have doubtful trumas meiser of Demai, it's going to be like a doubtful mixture. In other words, it's going to be a mixture of truma gadola. And we know that, if you have a doubtful mixture, it's going to be exempt from the Demai obligation, just like a mixture of truma and tevel. And really, what this is trying to point out is that when you're separating out definite tevel for definite Demai, the separated portion is either going to be truma, and in that case, the Demai would also be tevel, or it's going to be tevel. And that would be the case where the Demai is chulin. But what you're getting out is certainly not chulin. And there's no possibility of this being chulin. It's not doubtful truma, and so then the laws of Demai would be in effect. And that's really what we're getting at. In other words, we're getting at that this is really to protect for the possibility that you went through the separations, and at the end, you're still left with tevel, and you didn't actually rectify anything. That's really what we're worried about. Have a great day.